When my brother's best friend stayed over, I should have known I was playing a dangerous game. What happens when the one person you've tried to forget is suddenly sleeping just down the hall, his presence a constant reminder of everything you can't have? What happens when years of buried tension finally reach their breaking point? That night, the walls I had carefully built crumbled, and as I stood there, my body betraying me, my pulse roaring in my ears, I knew there was no turning back. This isn't just a mistake. It's a ticking time bomb, and I have no idea how it will end. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping, real-life tales like this one. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. When my brother's best friend stayed over, I knew I was playing with fire. The air in the house felt different with him there, thick with something unspoken, something dangerous. I had spent years pretending that Nathan was just my brother's closest friend, that the stolen glances, the almost moments, the way my breath hitched whenever he was near, it had all been in my head. But as I stood there in the dimly lit kitchen, watching him lean against the counter, shirtless, his sweatpants hanging low on his hips, I knew I had been lying to myself all along. It started with a look, the kind that lingered a second too long, that sent a ripple of heat down my spine, then a step closer, the scent of him, clean, masculine, something I remembered all too well from years ago. My fingers trembled against the cold glass of water I had grabbed just for something to do, anything to keep my hands occupied, to keep them from reaching for him. You okay? His voice was smooth, deep, laced with something that made my stomach tighten. I nodded, too quickly. Yeah, just couldn't sleep. His lips curved at the edges, like he knew, me neither. The silence between us was heavy, thick with everything we weren't saying. He was too close. I should have moved. But I didn't. You know, he murmured, his voice low enough that it sent a shiver down my spine. I used to wonder. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the glass. Wonder what? His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt it, that pull, that magnetic force that had been there for as long as I could remember. What would have happened, he said, his voice a whisper, if things had been different? My heart pounded against my ribs. Nathan, tell me you haven't thought about it, he said, his voice softer now, almost teasing, but the weight behind it was undeniable. I should have walked away. I should have shut this down. But my pulse was racing, my skin burning under his gaze, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in so long. Alive. Nathan wasn't just my brother's best friend. He was temptation wrapped in familiarity, danger disguised as comfort. And that night, as the world slept around us, I did the one thing I swore I never would. I let it happen. The moment Nathan walked through the front door, I felt it. That shift in the air, that undeniable pull, like gravity itself had changed its rules. It had been years since I'd seen him, years since I convinced myself that whatever had once existed between us had faded into nothing. But standing there, watching him drop his duffel bag by the couch, his body relaxed and confident, his dark eyes flicking up to meet mine with a knowing smirk, I knew I had been lying to myself. Liam clapped Nathan on the back, their easy laughter filling the space between us. My brother had no idea what was running through my mind at that moment, how my stomach twisted with something dangerously close to anticipation, how my breath caught in my throat when Nathan shrugged off his jacket, revealing the fitted shirt beneath, hugging his broad shoulders, his toned arms. I shouldn't have noticed. I shouldn't have let my eyes linger. But I did. Man, it's been too long, Nathan said, his voice just as smooth, just as teasing as I remembered. He turned his attention to me, eyes sweeping over me in a way that made my skin burn. Claire, didn't think I'd see you here. I forced a smile, shifting on my feet. Where else would I be? I live here. He chuckled, and there it was, that lazy, cocky grin that had once been the cause of so many sleepless nights. Right, married life and all that. My stomach clenched at the way he said it, at the flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. He wasn't just stating a fact, he was testing me. Liam, completely oblivious, grabbed Nathan's bag and tossed it toward the guest room. Yeah, dude, you'll crash in here. Hope the bed's comfortable enough. Nathan shrugged, stretching his arms above his head, the motion making his shirt ride up slightly, revealing a sliver of tanned skin. Better than the backseat of my car, so I'll take it. I turned away, busying myself with absolutely nothing, willing my heartbeat to settle. This was ridiculous. Nathan was just my brother's best friend. Nothing more. Except we both knew that wasn't true. Dinner was casual, filled with laughter, Liam catching up with Nathan about all the things they had missed in each other's lives. I barely contributed, too focused on the way Nathan's fingers tapped lightly against the rim of his beer bottle. The way his gaze would flick toward me when he thought I wasn't looking. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to see just how much I could take, Liam checked his phone, groaned, and pushed back his chair. Crap, I forgot I have to pick up Stephanie. She got stuck at her friend's place across town. I blinked. Wait, you're leaving? Liam grabbed his keys, barely paying attention. Yeah, should only take an hour. You two don't kill each other while I'm gone. And just like that, we were alone. The second the front door shut, the silence in the house changed. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't empty. It was thick, electric, buzzing with the kind of energy that made my breath unsteady. Nathan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as he swirled the bottle in his hand. Guess it's just us then. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling against my lap. Looks like it. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight or adjust his posture. He just watched me, studied me, as if he could see right through every carefully constructed defense I had spent years building. It's been a while, he said, voice lower now, quieter. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. You happy? The question caught me off guard. It was so simple, so direct. But there was something about the way he asked it, something that made my chest tighten. Of course, I answered automatically, my voice a little too quick, a little too practiced. Nathan's lips curved at the edges, but his eyes held something else. Good. He took a sip of his beer, licking a drop from his lower lip. That's all that matters, right? Something inside me twisted. He was toying with me. He knew exactly what he was doing. I stood abruptly, pushing back my chair. I should clean up. Nathan leaned back, stretching again, his arms resting behind his head as he smirked up at me. Need help? No. The word came out too fast, too sharp. I cleared my throat. I got it. I turned toward the sink, hoping that if I just busied myself, if I just kept moving, this strange, suffocating energy between us would dissipate. But then I felt him. Close. Too close. His presence behind me was a warmth against my back, not touching, but there, hovering just near enough that my skin prickled. I closed my eyes. Nathan, relax, he murmured, his breath just brushing my ear. Just grabbing a glass. I exhaled, forcing myself to step aside. He reached past me, his body brushing mine just slightly, just enough to send a jolt of something down my spine. The air in the kitchen was thick, charged, and I knew that this wasn't innocent. Nathan took his time, his fingers skimming over the glasses before he finally grabbed one, filling it with water. I watched his throat bob as he drank, the way the muscles in his jaw flexed when he swallowed. And then, as if he hadn't just shattered every ounce of my composure, he turned, smirked, and walked back to the living room. I let out a slow, shaky breath. This wasn't happening. This couldn't happen. I had a husband, a good man, a stable life. But as I glanced toward the living room, catching the way Nathan was sprawled on the couch, arm draped lazily over the back, gaze fixed on me with quiet amusement, I knew one undeniable truth. It was already happening. It started with a whisper of a moment, a breath between us, a shift in the air that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. My hands trembled as I wiped down the counter, my movements rigid, forced, as if keeping busy would somehow erase the way my body was responding to his presence. Nathan was still in the living room, his long legs stretched out, his fingers lazily tapping against the armrest, watching me with an unreadable expression. I could feel his gaze on me. It was searing, patient, like he was waiting for something. I should have walked away, locked myself in my room, put distance between us before something irreversible happened. But I didn't. Instead, I lingered in the kitchen, drawing out every meaningless task, refusing to look at him because I knew, God, I knew, that if I did, I'd be lost. "You're quiet," he finally said, his voice low, casual, but edged with something else. I swallowed hard, forcing a small smile. "Just tired," he hummed, the sound vibrating in the air between us. "You always were a terrible liar." His words made my stomach flip, a slow, molten sensation curling in my chest. I clenched my jaw, trying to steady myself. "I'm not lying." Nathan exhaled, shaking his head slightly, his lips quirking as if I had just said something amusing. "Right." Silence stretched between us, thick, pressing. He was waiting for me to crack, to acknowledge what was happening, but I couldn't, I wouldn't. Then he moved. It was slow, almost lazy, as he stood from the couch, his every motion deliberate, confident, like a predator taking its time before pouncing. I should have stepped back, should have created space, but my feet wouldn't move. He stopped, just a few inches away, his height forcing me to tilt my chin to meet his gaze. I could smell him, clean soap, and something inherently him, something I had never forgotten. My pulse thundered in my ears as his fingers reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. It was such a simple thing, so casual, so innocent in theory. But it wasn't. It was deliberate, calculated, and it unraveled me. "Claire," he murmured, my name barely more than a breath, like he was testing how it felt on his tongue. I sucked in a sharp inhale, stepping back abruptly. "We can't do this." Nathan didn't move, didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked onto mine, dark, knowing. I didn't say we were doing anything. He was teasing me, pushing me, and God help me, it was working. I turned, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could ground me. "You should go to bed." Silent. "And then? Do you want me to?" The question shattered every last thread of resolve I had left. My grip on the counter tightened, my knuckles white, my breath uneven. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to say yes, to end this before it went too far. But I couldn't, because I didn't want him to go. I felt him move before I saw him. He didn't touch me, but he was close, so close that his warmth pressed against my back, making every nerve in my body stand on end. "Say the word, Claire," he murmured, his voice dipping into something darker, something intoxicating. "Tell me to walk away." I opened my mouth. The words were right there, balanced on the edge of my tongue. But then his fingers brushed against my arm, the lightest, briefest touch, and every rational thought evaporated. I turned. I shouldn't have, but I did, and the second my gaze met his, I knew I was lost. Nathan's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides, like he was fighting something just as powerful as what was raging inside me. His gaze flicked to my lips, just for a second, just long enough to make my breath hitch, before he met my eyes again. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was me, maybe it didn't matter. Because 1 second, we were standing there, hearts pounding, breaths uneven, and the next, his mouth was on mine. It wasn't soft, it wasn't gentle, it was desperate, frantic, hungry, like years of restraint had snapped all at once. My fingers tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer, needing him closer. His hands found my waist, gripping, anchoring, as if he was afraid I'd change my mind. I wasn't going to. I couldn't. My back hit the counter as he deepened the kiss, his fingers sliding up my spine, setting every inch of my skin on fire. His touch was a memory I had never allowed myself to relive. A what if that had haunted me for years. And now it was real. A sharp gasp broke between us as he lifted me effortlessly onto the counter, settling between my legs, his hands framing my face. I should have stopped him. I should have told him this was a mistake. But all I could do was cling to him, my nails digging into his arms as his lips trailed down my jaw, my throat, every inch of me burning under his touch. "Nathan," I whispered, my voice shaking. His hands tightened on my waist, his forehead resting against mine. "Tell me to stop." I didn't, because I didn't want him to. Instead, I kissed him again. And just like that, the last shred of hesitation dissolved. There was no logic, no morality, no thought of consequences. There was only this. Only him. The sound of my brother's car pulling into the driveway was a gunshot to my chest. Nathan's entire body tensed against mine, his breath ragged, his hands still gripping my waist. For a moment, neither of us moved. The spell between us hadn't broken. It had shattered, leaving behind nothing but jagged edges and the reality of what we had just done. A harsh breath escaped me as I pushed against his chest, sliding off the counter, my legs unsteady. Nathan didn't speak, didn't move. His gaze burned into mine, something wild and unreadable flickering in the depths of his eyes. And then, just as the front door creaked open, he smirked, as if he knew, as if this was only the beginning. Liam's voice echoed through the hallway, casual and oblivious, just seconds after I scrambled off the counter. My breath was still uneven, my lips still tingling, my pulse still hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free from my chest. I moved fast, gripping the edges of the sink as if steadying myself would erase the heat still lingering on my skin. Nathan stepped back, but not far enough. Not enough to undo what had just happened, not enough to stop the way my body still hummed with his touch. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those damn eyes, held a knowing gleam, as if he could still feel me against him, as if the imprint of my hands on his body was something he wasn't willing to let go of just yet. The door shut with a click, followed by Liam's heavy footsteps approaching the kitchen. My hands trembled as I reached for a glass, filling it with water just to have something, anything, to do. "Hey, sorry that took longer than I thought," Liam said, oblivious, completely unaware of the chaos that had just unfolded in his own home. He tossed his keys on the counter, glancing between me and Nathan. "What'd I miss?" Nathan smirked, the same smirk that had always driven me insane, the same smirk that told me he was enjoying this, enjoying the way I was unraveling, enjoying the fact that I couldn't catch my breath. "Not much," he said smoothly, voice even, effortless, "just catching up." I gripped the edge of the counter tighter. Liam grabbed a beer from the fridge, popping the cap off before taking a swig. "Damn, it's been forever, man. Feels like old times, huh?" Nathan chuckled, low and deep, but he was still looking at me. "Almost." I couldn't take it. I needed space, air, distance from the man who had just ignited something inside me that I wasn't ready to confront. "I'm gonna head to bed," I blurted, setting my glass down with a little too much force. "It's late." Liam barely looked up. "Yeah, good call. You good, Nate?" Nathan stretched, his shirt lifting just enough to remind me of how dangerously close I had been to him moments ago. "Yeah, I think I'll turn in too." I spun on my heel and walked away before I could do something reckless. Again. But I wasn't fast enough. Because as I reached the hallway, Nathan moved too, his steps deliberately slow, his presence right behind me. My stomach clenched. My breathing turned shallow. I didn't need to look over my shoulder to know he was close. I could feel him. The second we were out of Liam's sight, I turned, my whisper sharp. "What the hell are you doing?" Nathan cocked his head, amused. "Walking to my room." I gritted my teeth, my nails digging into my palms. "You need to stop looking at me like that." His smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. "Like what?" I hated him in that moment, hated the way he made me feel, hated the way my body still ached for something I knew I couldn't have. "Like you're waiting for me to make another mistake." Nathan stepped closer, too close. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Is that what you think?" I swallowed hard. "It's not happening again." He exhaled a quiet laugh, his fingers brushing the wall beside me, caging me in without touching me. "That's cute." My pulse was a drumbeat in my throat. "Nathan, you want me to stop?" His voice was soft, taunting. "Say the word." I should have said it. I should have walked away, but I just stood there, rooted to the spot, drowning in the intensity of him, the heat of him, the sheer gravity of him. His gaze dropped to my lips, his breath warm against my skin. "You're not saying it," he murmured. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my skin, trying to ground myself in anything other than the pull between us. "I'm not doing this," I whispered, shaking my head. Nathan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something darker, something knowing. "Okay," he said finally, stepping back. "Good night, Claire." And just like that, he was gone. I didn't breathe until I was in my room with the doors shut, my back pressed against it, my heart threatening to rip its way out of my chest. This couldn't happen again. But deep down, I already knew the truth. You know what? It was only a matter of time. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel him. His breath, his hands, the weight of his gaze burning through me. I turned over, my pillow doing nothing to cool the heat radiating through my body. I was a horrible person. I was a married woman. And yet none of that stopped me from standing up, from padding across the room, from cracking open the door and peeking down the hallway. Nathan's door was ajar. I didn't even think, I just moved. My pulse pounded with every step, the sound of my own breathing deafening in the quiet house. I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't. But then I was at his door, and he was awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at me like he had been expecting me all along. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. Because when he stood, when he reached for me, when his fingers slid against my skin, there was no hesitation. Only hunger, only heat, only the sound of my own betrayal echoing in the darkness. The sun rose too soon. I hadn't moved. Nathan was still asleep beside me, his arm heavy across my waist, his breath steady and warm against my bare shoulder. Regret sank in, slow, creeping, curling around my throat like a vice. I had done it. I had really done it. And there was no going back now. Nathan stirred beside me, a soft exhale leaving his lips as his fingers brushed over my stomach, lazy, possessive. His eyes blinked open, still heavy with sleep, but his smirk was immediate. "Orne," he murmured, voice rough, husky. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. This was a mistake. His fingers traced slow, aimless patterns on my skin. "Was it?" I sat up too fast, wrapping the sheets around me, my mind spinning. Nathan didn't move, just propped himself up on one elbow, watching me with that infuriating calm. "I need to go," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his fingers grazing my wrist. "Do you?" I jerked away. "Nathan, don't." Something flickered in his gaze, something almost amused. "Okay," he said, hands raised in surrender. "Whatever you say." I grabbed my clothes, forcing myself to move, to walk away, to put one foot in front of the other, even as my body screamed to do the opposite. But just as I reached the door, his voice stopped me. "Claire," it didn't turn around. "You're gonna come back." I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath shuddering out of me. And the worst part? I knew he was right. I couldn't look at him. Not when I stepped out of his room, not when I tiptoed down the hallway, not even when I shut the bathroom door behind me and braced myself against the cold sink. My hands trembled as I turned the faucet, splashing icy water onto my face, hoping it would wash away the heat still lingering on my skin. But it didn't. Nothing could erase the feeling of him, the weight of his body against mine, the way his mouth had found every single place that made me forget who I was, what I had, what I stood to lose. I had done something unforgivable. And the worst part? I wasn't sorry. I gripped the edges of the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My lips were swollen, my cheeks flushed, my eyes wild with something I didn't want to name. My body still ached in places it shouldn't, a dull, pulsing reminder of the man who was still lying in bed, of the sheets I had tangled myself in, of the heat I had surrendered to so easily. I had to fix this. I had to find a way to erase it before it unraveled me completely. But even as I tried to convince myself that I would put an end to it, my pulse betrayed me. Because when I closed my eyes, all I saw was Nathan. I didn't know how long I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to force logic back into my bones, but eventually I moved. I straightened, wiped my face with a towel, and forced myself to walk back to my room. I barely made it 3 steps before I heard the creak of a door behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. I felt him. Nathan leaned against his doorframe, still shirtless, his sweatpants hanging low on his hips, his hair a mess from my fingers. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me, his gaze dragging over me like he could still feel me under him, like he was memorizing the way I looked after he had completely unraveled me. I should have kept walking. I should have ignored him. But I didn't. I turned slowly, my breath catching the second my eyes met his. His smirk was lazy, teasing, but his eyes, they were darker now, heavy with something dangerous. "You left fast." I swallowed hard. I shouldn't have been there in the first place. Nathan exhaled a quiet laugh, his tongue running along the inside of his cheek. "That's not what you were saying last night." A fresh wave of heat crashed over me, humiliation mixed with something I didn't want to name. I clenched my fists, my nails biting into my palms. This was a mistake. His smirk didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. "You keep saying that," he murmured, pushing off the doorframe and taking a slow step toward me. "But I don't think you believe it." I took a step back. "Nathan, stop." He did. For a moment, we just stood there, the hallway thick with something heavy, something suffocating. Then his expression changed, his teasing smirk fading into something quieter, something almost raw. His voice dropped. Do you regret it? My stomach twisted. We can't do this. It's not what I asked. His gaze was unwavering, steady, and it made something inside me crumble. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell him that I regretted every second, that I wished it had never happened. But the words refused to form, sticking to the back of my throat like they knew they didn't belong there. And Nathan saw it. His jaw clenched slightly, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. Instead, he let out a slow breath, running a hand through his already messy hair. Okay, he finally said, voice quieter now, rougher. I get it. I didn't know what he meant by that, and I didn't have the courage to ask. So I did the only thing I could. I turned around and walked away. For the next 24 hours, I avoided him. I stayed in my room for most of the day, only coming out when I knew Liam was around, making sure that every interaction with Nathan was brief, casual, distant. It was torture, pretending that my skin didn't burn every time he was near, pretending that my body didn't betray me every time his voice cut through the room. I could feel him watching me, feel his presence like a gravitational pull I couldn't escape. And then it happened. Kyle called. His voice was warm, familiar, safe, the voice of the man I had vowed to love, to be faithful to, the voice of the man I had just betrayed in the worst possible way. Hey, baby, he murmured. Miss me? My throat closed. My fingers curled so tightly around my phone that my knuckles turned white. I squeezed my eyes shut. Yeah, I lied. I miss you. I heard the smile in his voice. Only a few more days, then I'm all yours. Something inside me cracked. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah, can't wait. The call ended, and I stood there, staring at my reflection in the dark window, trying to figure out who the hell I had become. And then, a voice behind me. Soft, familiar, dangerous. You don't sound very convincing. I turned sharply, my pulse spiking, as I found Nathan standing in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. I gritted my teeth. Not now. Nathan didn't move. You gonna tell him? A chill ran down my spine. Tell him what? His head tilted slightly, his gaze never wavering. The truth. My stomach twisted violently. There is no truth to tell. Nathan's lips pressed together, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then, slowly, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I swallowed hard. Nathan, I wasn't gonna say anything, he said, voice quiet, measured. But you keep looking at me like that, and I'm starting to think you want this to happen again. Panic flared in my chest. I don't. His gaze dipped to my lips. Then why do you look like you're lying? My heart was a riot in my chest. This is over. Nathan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You keep saying that, but you don't mean it. I clenched my jaw, stepping forward, shoving against his chest. You don't get to do this to me. He caught my wrists before I could pull away, his grip firm but not painful, his eyes burned into mine, his breath fanning against my skin. You think this is just me? He murmured. You think I'm the only one who wanted this? I yanked my hands free, my breath coming too fast. It was a mistake. Nathan's expression hardened. You keep telling yourself that. I turned away, pressing my palms against my face, forcing myself to breathe, to think, to push away the memory of his hands on me, his mouth on mine. I heard him sigh behind me, the sound heavy, tired. You don't have to say it, he murmured. I already know you're coming back. I spun to face him, anger flashing hot through me. You don't know anything about me. Nathan's lips curved, but there was no humor in his eyes. I know enough. He let the words settle between us before he stepped back, giving me one last look before he turned and left the room. I stood there, breathless, shaking, trying to pretend that I wasn't already breaking apart, because he was right, and that terrified me more than anything else. I barely slept. The hours passed in a haze of restless tossing, sheets tangled around my legs, my body still betraying me, still remembering the way Nathan had felt against me, the way his mouth had claimed mine, the way his hands had burned every inch of my skin. The guilt sat heavy in my chest, thick and suffocating, yet beneath it, buried deep where I didn't want to acknowledge it, was something else. Something darker, something dangerous. I wanted him. Even now, even after everything, after the heated words, after the way he had stood in my room, taunting me with the truth I refused to admit, I still wanted him. And that made me the worst kind of person. Morning came too soon. Sunlight filtered through my blinds, but it did nothing to warm the ice in my veins. I lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, forcing myself to breathe, to push away the weight pressing against my ribs. I had to fix this. I had to bury it. I forced myself up, pulling on a sweater, ignoring the way my body ached in places it shouldn't. I couldn't think about that. I couldn't think about him. The house was quiet when I stepped into the hallway. Liam was still asleep, his door shut. Soft snores drifting from inside. Nathan's door was open. My stomach clenched. I should have been relieved that he was gone, that I wouldn't have to see him, wouldn't have to endure the smug glint in his eyes, wouldn't have to feel his presence like a living, breathing temptation. But I wasn't relieved. I was disappointed. I gritted my teeth against the wave of frustration, stalking toward the kitchen. Coffee. I needed coffee. Something normal, something grounding. I had barely reached for a mug when I felt it. That familiar presence. That suffocating awareness. I turned too fast, my breath catching when I found him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, gaze fixed on me like he was waiting. Nathan, still here, still looking at me like I was something he had already claimed. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, clattering against the counter. I snatched it up, heart pounding. I thought you left. Nathan didn't move. Wanted to say goodbye. His voice was calm, easy, but there was something else beneath it. Something sharp, something testing. I swallowed hard. Well, you said it. A slow, knowing smirk. Not quite. I clenched my jaw. Nathan? He pushed off the doorway, taking a step forward, closing the distance between us with terrifying ease. You're really gonna pretend last night didn't happen? His voice was quiet, measured, but there was an edge to it, something dark curling around the words. I gripped the counter behind me. It didn't mean anything. Nathan let out a soft, humorless laugh. Right. My fingers dug into the cold surface. I love my husband. His smirk didn't waver. Did you love him when you were in my bed? The breath punched from my lungs, my grip faltered. His voice dipped lower. Did you love him when you were moaning my name? Heat flared in my chest, a violent, suffocating mixture of anger and shame. Stop. Nathan exhaled a slow breath, tilting his head slightly. Tell me you didn't want it. I opened my mouth. The lie was right there, poised on the edge of my tongue. But I couldn't say it, because we both knew the truth. Nathan stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me you don't want it again. My stomach twisted. You're leaving. This is over. His lips curved, but his eyes weren't teasing anymore. They were dark, unreadable. Sure, Claire. Whatever helps you sleep at night. I didn't move until he turned, until I heard the front door click shut behind him, until the silence in the house swallowed me whole. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was the slow, creeping ache of something unfinished. Kyle came home 2 days later. His arrival should have been a relief. It should have grounded me, reassured me, reminded me of why I had spent years choosing him. But the second his arms wrapped around me, the second his lips pressed against my temple, I felt nothing. No spark, no warmth, no fire. Nothing. And that terrified me more than anything else. I went through the motions, smiled at the right moments, let him kiss me, hold me, touch me. But every time his fingers traced over my skin, all I could think about was Nathan. How he had felt, how he had ruined me. I hated myself for it. Kyle was a good man. He was steady, kind, the type of husband every woman should want. And yet, the entire time he was home, all I could think about was how different it felt. How empty. How lifeless. It had never felt like that before. Or maybe it had and I had just never noticed. Maybe it had taken Nathan to show me what I had been missing all along. The guilt festered. It curled around my ribs, poisoning every glance, every touch, every word that left my lips. Kyle didn't notice. Or maybe he just didn't want to. Maybe that was worse. I told myself it would fade, that it was just a mistake, a moment of weakness, something I could lock away and forget. But forgetting Nathan was impossible, because 2 weeks after he left, he texted me, and I shouldn't have answered. I shouldn't have answered, but I did. And the second I saw his name on my screen, I knew this wasn't over. It had never been over. It was only just beginning. The text sat on my screen like a loaded gun, waiting for me to pull the trigger. 3 simple words, so casual, so effortless, yet dripping with something far more dangerous. Miss me yet? My thumb hovered over the keyboard, my breath shallow, my pulse drumming beneath my skin. I shouldn't have answered. Every rational part of me screamed at me to delete it, to pretend I hadn't seen it, to move on like nothing had ever happened. But nothing had ever been the same since the moment I let him touch me. Since the moment I touched him back. My fingers moved before I could stop them. A betrayal I had no control over. Don't do this. The reply came instantly, as if he had been waiting, as if he knew. Do what? I gritted my teeth, staring at the screen, my grip tightening around the phone. You know what? A pause. Then, tell me you don't think about me. Tell me you don't want it again. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. He was impossible. He was relentless. He was right. And that was the problem. I should have blocked his number. I should have thrown my phone across the room, shattered it, buried it under the weight of my regret. But instead, my fingers betrayed me again. It doesn't matter what I want. I hated the way my heart pounded as I watched the dots appear, the way my skin prickled with anticipation for whatever he would say next. That's not a no. I clenched my jaw, closing my eyes for a brief second, inhaling through my nose, forcing myself to think, to push through the thick fog of whatever this was, whatever he was doing to me. I love my husband. The words felt hollow. And Nathan knew it. Sure you do. My grip tightened around the phone, my nails biting into my palm. Goodbye, Nathan. I turned the phone over, face down on the table, my hands shaking. This was over. I wouldn't let him do this to me again. I couldn't. I didn't check my phone again for the rest of the night. I couldn't trust myself. Every second, every hour that passed, I felt the weight of his words pressing against me, creeping into my thoughts, sinking into my bones. Miss me yet? Tell me you don't want it again. Sure you do. I clenched my fists, shutting my eyes tight. I could still hear him, could still feel his voice whispering against my skin, the heat of him branding me in a way that refused to fade. I had to stop this. But when I climbed into bed that night, Kyle's arm draping over my waist, his body warm against mine, all I could feel was how different it was, how wrong it felt, how empty. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind running in circles, replaying every moment, every touch, every whispered word that had destroyed me. This was supposed to be the life I wanted. Then why did it feel like something was missing? The following weeks were torture. I threw myself into my routine, into work, into anything that would distract me from the weight pressing against my chest, from the slow, creeping realization that nothing felt right anymore. Kyle noticed. He didn't say anything at first, but I caught the way his eyes lingered on me longer, the way his touch hesitated before settling against my skin, the way his voice softened when he asked, "Are you okay?" And I lied, over and over again, because the truth was a burden I couldn't share, because the truth was something I didn't want to admit to myself. I thought I could escape it. I thought that if I ignored the texts, if I avoided anything that reminded me of him, that it would eventually fade. But then on a crisp evening when the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, when the air smelled like burning wood and distant rain, I saw him, Nathan, standing across the street, leaning against his car, watching me. My breath hitched, my body freezing in place. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to look at me like that, like he still owned a part of me I had no right to give. He knew. He knew. I forced myself to move, to keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen him, to pretend that I wasn't unraveling beneath his gaze. But then, a message. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Turn around. I didn't. I couldn't. Another buzz. One more time, that's all I'm asking. My fingers curled around my phone, my heart slamming against my ribs. I walked faster. A third buzz. You don't want to say no. And I didn't. I gritted my teeth, hating him, hating myself, hating the way my body still ached for something I had no right to want. But I didn't stop. I kept walking. And for the first time, Nathan let me. Days passed. Then weeks. The silence between us stretched wide, a chasm I wasn't sure I was relieved or devastated by. I kept waiting for another message, another call, another chance for me to prove to myself that I had some level of self-control. But he never reached out again. And that was worse, because that meant he was done. That meant he had walked away first. And the sickest part of it all, it hurt. More than it should have, more than I could admit. It should have been relief. It should have felt like a clean break. But instead it felt like a loss I had no right to feel. I told myself it was for the best, that I had won, that I had made the right choice. But the nights still stretched long and restless. The bed still felt too cold, too empty, despite the man lying beside me. And I still woke up in the middle of the night, heart racing, body aching, reaching for something, someone who wasn't there. Time would fix this. It had to. But deep down I knew the truth. Some things aren't meant to be buried. Some mistakes don't fade. Some fires never go out. And no matter how many times I told myself I had moved on, a part of me would always be waiting for Nathan to text me one last time. One last time, just to see if I'd still answer. And God help me. I knew I would. I thought I had won. I thought Nathan had finally given up. that he had accepted my silence, my avoidance, my desperate attempt to bury what we had done. I thought he had let me go, but I was wrong. It started small, little things. Kyle coming home later than usual, the way he checked his phone more often, his expression unreadable. At first, I didn't think anything of it. After all, I was the one with secrets. I was the one with guilt clawing at my throat every time he looked at me with those trusting eyes. And then, one night, I saw it. A text message. I wasn't looking for anything. I hadn't turned into the paranoid wife who snooped through her husband's phone. But Kyle had left it on the counter while he stepped into the shower, and when the screen lit up, the name flashed across the screen like a gunshot to my chest. Nathan. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The message was short. Everything good? My vision blurred at the edges, my pulse hammering in my ears. I grabbed the phone before I could stop myself, my fingers shaking as I stared at the text, at the name, at the horrible, impossible reality staring back at me. Why the hell was Nathan texting Kyle? And then, worse, Kyle's response. Yeah, she has no idea. The room spun, my stomach twisted so violently I thought I might be sick. She has no idea. No idea about what? I stood there, frozen, the phone like a dead weight in my hands, my mind scrambling to make sense of something that had none. Kyle had barely spoken about Nathan since his visit. As far as I knew, they weren't close. Not enough to be texting like this. Not enough for Nathan to be asking if everything was good. And Kyle... Cold. The sound of the shower shutting off jolted me back to reality. I barely had enough time to set the phone back down, to move away from the counter, before Kyle stepped out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, his hair damp, his skin still glistening with steam. He smiled at me, like nothing was wrong, like he wasn't hiding something from me. I forced myself to smile back. Hey. His eyes flickered to the counter, to his phone, just for a second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But I saw it. I saw the way his fingers twitched, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed, the way his casual demeanor seemed just a little too forced. And I knew something was very, very wrong. I had spent weeks drowning in my own guilt, my own mistakes, my own lies. I had spent weeks trying to convince myself that I was the villain, that I was the one betraying my husband, that I was the one who had shattered the trust in our marriage. But now I wasn't so sure. Kyle kissed my temple as he walked past me, completely unaware that the ground beneath me had just cracked open. Long day? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, because suddenly I wasn't sure if I was the only one keeping secrets. And worse, I wasn't sure if I was the only one being played. For the next few days, I watched. I listened. I paid attention in a way I never had before. Kyle's routine hadn't changed, not exactly, but the details, the little things. The way he held his phone closer, turned it face down when we sat at dinner. The way he left the room when he took calls, his voice lower than usual. The way he looked at me sometimes, like he knew, like he had always known. And then, the final nail in the coffin. I waited until he was asleep, his breathing deep and steady beside me, before I slid out of bed and tiptoed into the bathroom, his phone gripped tightly in my hand. My heart pounded against my ribs as I unlocked it. The passcode hadn't changed. He hadn't thought I would ever look. But I did, and I found everything. Text messages, calls, emails, not just with Nathan, with other people, people I didn't know. people who had been watching me, tracking me, every move I had made since Nathan left. Screenshots of my texts with Nathan, of my missed calls to him, of me standing at the window staring at my phone, waiting for something, anything from him. And then at the very bottom, a message from Kyle to Nathan. She's ready. The phone slipped from my fingers, crashing against the floor with a sharp thud. Kyle stirred in bed, shifting slightly, but didn't wake. I stared at the screen, at those two words, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She's ready. Ready for what? My hands were shaking. My entire body was shaking. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't just betrayal. This was something else. Something I hadn't seen coming. Something I still didn't understand. I backed out of the bathroom, my limbs numb, my mind racing, my breath too loud in the silence of the house. Kyle shifted again, this time rolling onto his back, his eyes fluttering open, his voice groggy, heavy with sleep. Claire? I didn't answer, because for the first time in my life, I was afraid of my own husband. I turned, walking quickly, quietly down the hall toward the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock, my pulse roaring in my ears. I needed air. I needed out. And then, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out of my pocket, my vision blurring as I read the message that had just come in. A new number. No name. Don't trust him. I sucked in a sharp breath, my fingers tightening around my phone. And then, another buzz. You were never supposed to find out. My stomach dropped. I turned my head, glancing over my shoulder. Kyle was standing in the hallway, awake, watching me. And for the first time, I saw it. The truth. The mask slipping. The darkness in his eyes. I had spent so long wondering if I had destroyed my marriage, if I was the one who had broken everything. But now, as I stared at the man I had vowed to love, the man who had held me in his arms for years, the man I had believed I knew, I realized something far worse. I had never really known Kyle at all. The air in the house felt wrong. It was the kind of silence that pressed against my ears, thick and suffocating, filled with something unseen but undeniably there. Kyle hadn't moved from the hallway. He stood there, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the nightlight, his shoulders relaxed, his hands loose at his sides. But there was something about his stance that made my breath catch. He was watching me, not in the way a husband looks at his wife, not with warmth or concern or love. He was studying me, calculating, like he was waiting for me to react, waiting for me to slip, waiting for me to do something. My phone was still clutched in my hand, the messages burning into the screen. Don't trust him. You were never supposed to find out. Kyle's voice broke the silence. What are you doing? My throat tightened. I forced my fingers to loosen around my phone, tried to look casual, like I hadn't just been standing there, on the verge of running. Couldn't sleep, I murmured, swallowing against the dryness in my throat. I was going to get some water. His head tilted slightly, just enough to make my stomach twist. I nodded. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step forward. My pulse spiked. I didn't move. You're acting strange, he said, voice smooth, calm, too calm. I let out a quiet laugh, the sound unnatural even to my own ears. I am strange. You married me, remember? His lips twitched. Not a real smile, just something empty, something meant to disarm me. I forced my feet to move, stepping toward the kitchen, willing my body to act normal, to push down the terror clawing its way up my throat. I could feel him behind me, his presence heavy, unshakable. The second I reached the counter, I gripped the edge, steadying myself. I had to get out of here. I had to figure out what the hell was going on. Kyle stepped closer. I could feel the heat of him, the weight of his gaze pressing into my back. "What's wrong, Claire?" I reached for a glass, trying to keep my hands from shaking. "Nothing." Another step. "You sure?" The water filled the cup too fast. It sloshed over the edge, spilling onto my fingers. I didn't move. I could feel it. The shift, the moment the air changed. Then, a knock at the door. The sound shattered the tension like a gunshot, cutting through the silence, making my heart slam into my ribs. Kyle's entire body stiffened. I turned my head just enough to see the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He wasn't expecting anyone. Another knock. Louder this time. Kyle exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "Stay here." I didn't argue, because suddenly I wanted to stay in the kitchen. Kyle moved toward the door, his steps measured, controlled. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't even look through the peephole before unlocking it and pulling it open. My breath caught the second I saw who was standing there. Nathan. My stomach twisted into something sharp, something brutal. He was supposed to be gone. He was supposed to be done with me. But he wasn't. He was standing in my doorway, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Kyle didn't move. "What are you doing here?" Nathan's gaze flickered past him, locking onto me. I saw it then, the concern, the barely contained frustration, the warning that had been laced into the messages he sent. He knew. I didn't know what he knew or how much, but it was enough for him to be here, enough for him to show up on my doorstep when he should have stayed far, far away. Nathan's voice was low, controlled. "Can we talk?" Kyle didn't answer right away. He just studied him, his eyes narrowing slightly, his head tilting as if reading him, dissecting him. Then, after a long, excruciating pause, he stepped back, opening the door just enough for Nathan to enter. Nathan hesitated. His gaze flicked back to me, just for a second, before he finally stepped inside. Kyle shut the door behind him. The lock clicked. I swallowed hard. Nathan shoved his hands deeper into his pockets. "Claire." Kyle's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You two been talking?" Nathan ignored him. His eyes didn't leave mine. "You okay?" Kyle let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "That's why you're here? To check on my wife?" Nathan's jaw clenched. "Something like that." Kyle exhaled slowly, crossing his arms over his chest. "That's cute." The tension in the room was suffocating. It was thick and dangerous and wrong. Nathan finally looked at him. "How long were you going to wait?" Kyle's expression didn't change. "Wait for what?" Nathan took a step closer, his voice dropping into something quieter, something edged with something I couldn't quite name. "For her to find out?" Kyle smiled. It was slow, calculated. "Find out what?" Nathan's entire body was wound tight, his hands clenching at his sides like he was forcing himself to stay calm. "I saw the messages." My voice was barely a whisper, but it shattered the standoff between them. Kyle turned his head slightly, looking at me out of the corner of his eye. "Did you?" My hands were shaking. I curled them into fists to hide it. "I know you've been talking to Nathan." Kyle let out a soft chuckle. "So?" "Though," Nathan snapped. "Why don't you tell her why?" The silence that followed was deafening. Kyle didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. And then, a slow, quiet exhale. "You're right," he murmured. "She does deserve to know." A chill raced down my spine. Kyle turned toward me fully now, his eyes darker than I had ever seen them. But I think it'd be better if she heard it from you, Nathan. Nathan's entire body tensed. Don't do this. Kyle raised a brow. Do what? Nathan's breathing was uneven now, his jaw locked, his shoulders squared like he was preparing for something bad. Kyle took a step toward me. Tell me, Claire, how much do you trust him? My throat was dry. What? Kyle tilted his head slightly, his smile never faltering. You think I was the only one keeping secrets? I looked at Nathan. His face was unreadable. Kyle's voice was a whisper. Ask him why he's here. The room spun. I turned to Nathan, my breath catching in my throat. Nathan? He didn't answer. He didn't move. Kyle took another step closer, his voice quieter now, softer, like he was enjoying this. He didn't come to save you, Claire. Nathan's jaw tightened. Kyle exhaled slowly, shaking his head. He came to finish what we started. A chill slithered down my spine. Nathan finally spoke, his voice tight, sharp. Shut up, Kyle. Kyle laughed, actually laughed. Oh, that's rich. You want to protect her now? Nathan's hands curled into fists at his sides. This isn't her fault. Kyle's gaze darkened. You think that matters? I took a step back, my pulse slamming into my ribs, my head spinning. Kyle smiled, and that's when I knew Nathan wasn't the hero in this story. He never was. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, my fingers gripping my phone so tightly I thought it might shatter. The air between Kyle and me stretched, thick and suffocating. His gaze locked onto mine with something unreadable, something that made every nerve in my body scream at me to run. But I didn't, because the moment I moved, the moment I took a step back, I knew I would be confirming everything. That I had seen the messages, that I knew, that I wasn't the clueless, devoted wife he had spent years shaping me into, that I had finally figured out the game. His lips curved slightly, just barely, but it wasn't a smile. It was something far more calculated, far more chilling. You're up late, he murmured, his voice calm, too calm. I swallowed, my pulse hammering against my throat. I couldn't sleep. His eyes flicked to my phone, then back to me. His expression didn't change. He took a step closer. My muscles tensed. Kyle had never hurt me before, never so much as raised his voice at me, but suddenly I wasn't so sure what he was capable of. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my voice. Why is Nathan texting you? His expression didn't flicker, didn't give anything away. We've been in touch. I already knew that, but the confirmation still sent ice down my spine. I whispered. Kyle's head tilted slightly, like he was considering his words, like he was deciding just how much he wanted to tell me. And then, after a long pause, he sighed. You really want to do this now? I clenched my jaw. What does she's ready mean? His gaze darkened, just slightly, just enough for me to see it. And then, a knock at the door. Loud, sharp. Kyle's head snapped toward the sound, his jaw tightening. My breath hitched. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was nearly midnight. I took a step back, my pulse a live wire beneath my skin. Kyle's expression shifted, just for a fraction of a second, something like annoyance. Like he knew who it was. Another knock. I flinched. Kyle exhaled, rolling his shoulders before turning toward the door. Stay here. I didn't. I followed. Every part of me was screaming to run, to hide, to do anything but follow him to that door. But I had to know. Kyle unlocked the deadbolt, his movement slow, deliberate. and when he pulled the door open, my stomach dropped. Nathan, standing on the doorstep, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark, cold, like I had never seen them before. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't caught between two men. I was caught in the middle of something I never saw coming, and I was never supposed to escape it.